To introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. Nicole Obeid. Nicole is a developmental psychologist and currently leads the Research and Outcomes Management for the Eating Disorder Program at CHEO. She is also a clinical investigator with the CHEO and an adjunct professor with the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. She is also president of the Eating Disorder Association of Canada. Nicole has over 10 years' experience working in the field of pediatric eating disorders, with research interests ranging from etiologic and maintenance factors to treatment of severe eating disorders, psychosocial models and protective factors, health system research focusing on early intervention, and applying patient-oriented outcomes research approaches to guide this work. She'll be speaking to us today about identifying research needs in anorexia nervosa from the patient and family perspective. Please join me in virtually welcoming Nicole this morning. Nicole, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Jabour, for such a lovely introduction, and also for the opportunity to share with you guys today a research project that we did over a course of 18 months, where we did a collaborative process to building shared research priorities, and a large priority setting exercise that we did with our eating disorder community nationally, entitled the Canadian Eating Disorder Priority Setting Partnership. I'm looking forward to sharing the study with you guys today. So our aims for today, three aims for today, is really to describe and define what patient-oriented research principles are and what is a priority setting exercise specifically. Then I'd like to share with you the methodology and the process we use to co-create the shared research priorities for females with anorexia nervosa. So specifically walk through the journey that we took with our project. And then lastly, share some reflections of how these priorities can be used in the field, which can likely be generalized to other fields, and then also offer some introductions for some next steps of what we can do with those priorities. So just to start and give a little background as to how we sort of came to the world of patient-oriented research and priority setting exercises. Just a bit of background about myself and our program is, like many of you, I wear two hats when I work in the eating disorder program here at CHEO. And so one of my hats, I work clinically with the patients and families that we see and serve within our program. But my other hat is I'm also a researcher with the program. And having those two roles really allows such a lovely opportunity for us to really capitalize on the wealth of expertise and knowledge we have, not just with our clinicians and the researchers on our team, but also the patients and families that we serve and their specific expertise that they gather as they walk through their own patient journey. And it's really learning about how having so many voices sort of participate in research thinking and brainstorming and bringing ideas to fruition that really sort of launched my interest and our team's interest in working towards some patient-oriented research methodologies. And so you can imagine, I was delighted when the Ontario SPOR support unit, strategy for patient-oriented research, when the Ontario SPOR support unit was offering what they called a masterclass on patient-oriented research. And this was back in December 2016, I believe, where we got together, 40 of us in a room for 3 days of a masterclass, learning about methodologies for patient-oriented research and many other pieces that go along with this kind of work. And some of the learnings that I took from that masterclass include things like, how do we define what patient-oriented research is really? And so this is the definition offered by CIHR, where it really talks about a continuum of research that engages patients as partners. And we focus on things like patient-identified priorities. So what's the most important things for us to be researching, but from the perspective of our patients and families, and how do we improve patient outcomes, ultimately improve patient outcomes? And of course, there's always a drive to do this research using multidisciplinary teams and intersectoral teams as well to really create impact with the work that you're doing. And what do we mean by engagement specifically? And this is really important for us to take note of, is that it's meaningful involvement of patients, caregivers, and clinicians in the healthcare process, and really talking about that full continuum of research where we're talking about having these folks involved and engaged, not only in answering a survey, but really from topic selection of what research to do, all the way through to design, to the conduct of research, to then the dissemination of those results. And so really, really engaging throughout the whole process, but finding meaningful ways to engage folks so that they can really lend their expertise in areas that make the most sense to them. Some of the guiding principles we learned during that masterclass really was to, think about things like inclusiveness when you're bringing a team together. How do you provide support to all the different players at the table? Using things like mutual respect and thinking about co-building versus one sort of person or team taking a lead on any one aspect of that research project. And there's different ways to engage patients as partners throughout the research process. And so, you can have the ability at sort of the highest level of engagement is to have patient partners jump in and join you as a research committee member, where they sort of sit side by side with an investigative team, and they do things like the planning, designing, really the strategic oversight of a project from inception to termination. And they're working side by side with you in new ways. And these are what we call patient partners. And I just want to take a second to really talk about how CIHR, when they use the word patients, they're really talking about anybody who's sort of touched by a health condition, if you will. And so they don't just talk about those with lived experience, personal lived experience, but they really define patients as those with lived experience, their carers, like their informal carers, that is, so parents, spouses, those that take care of that individual who has the condition. And then they also talk about clinicians being a part of that. Where they're talking about not that those clinicians have their own individual lived experience, but they have the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of patients within that patient population. And so when CIHR is talking about patients, they're really talking about those three stakeholder groups and bringing them together. And so we can have those stakeholder groups participate, like I said, as a committee member. We can also have them participate as a contributor to the research project, where they might come in to do specific aspects, but really thinking about it in a different way than we have sort of historically, where they can come in to, help you with a priority setting exercise. They can come in and help you with recruitment for specific pieces or data collection or what may it be. But they're providing a bit more contribution to the project than just filling out a survey or being a participant in a survey, in a study, my apologies. And then another category of how we can engage patients as partners is to have them sit in a support role, where they, they're very interested in the research study. They want to be kept abreast of how the research study is progressing. And they'll do things like, help with recruitment in terms of they'd be happy to disseminate an invitation for a research study or, recruitment flyers and those things. And so they're involved sort of at that level of the research. And when we jump, another thing, another big learning from that masterclass was really learning about these priority setting partnerships. And this is where I caught wind of how these exercises get executed. And so what is a priority setting partnership? It's really where we bring patients, carers, and clinicians. They come together as equal partners in this kind of work. We focus on a single health condition or an area of treatment of interest. Your job is to really identify treatment uncertainties, but using their full complement of those stakeholders. And then ultimately, the goal is to produce the top 10 list of priorities that are agreed upon by this range of stakeholders that have all, engaged in some consensus building to arrive at those top 10. More formally, we provide that definition of priority setting as calling it a collective activity for deciding which uncertainties are most worth trying to resolve through research. And then when we even dwindle down further to what is a patient-identified priority, this is where really we're talking about focusing on priorities that are the most important to patients in order to produce information that's truly taken up and used to create some impact. And of course, this requires some strong, successful collaboration intersectorally and multidisciplinary wise in order to be able to actually achieve that successfully. And why is this important? And I think what's really important for us to note is, when we think about who normally decides what gets researched and what gets put forward for research funding applications, it's not those that are most touched by a certain condition, and in our case, an eating disorder. It's really researchers and pharmaceutical industry or industry in general that really kind of decides what gets researched when we think about, money talks, and researchers are the ones putting in the grants. And what really struck me when I was learning about these priority setting exercises is that based on the experience I've had with our clinical program, you really start realizing that the priorities of those with lived experience and their families and the clinicians that we work with, they could have very different priorities than what's sort of being established by researchers and industry. And not only is that something I'm noticing in our own individual work, but this is something that's coming about, there's lots of research sort of happening to sort of solidify that concept that involving patients in these type of exercises adds a lot of merit and shift the way that we think about some of these pieces. And so in this study done in 2014 by Boivin and colleagues, they've done a cluster randomized trial looking at whether you can involving patients in these priority setting exercises and not. You know, one of the main conclusions that they drew from this work is that patient involvement can change priorities, driving healthcare improvements almost at the population level. When we think about how those priorities can really shift the research that's happening. And a priority setting exercise is really a multi-stage exercise that, you know, requires 10 steps to sort of achieve successfully. And so we start at the top here with defining what the objectives and the scope of what that priority setting exercise is to be all about. And this is really important because you don't want to go too broad in order to not, you know, create priorities that are unachievable, if you will. The next step is then to, you know, gather the team that's going to help you carry out this work, being very thoughtful and strategic in terms of how you're going to meaningfully engage folks in this work. There's then, you know, you move to trying to select some methods and valid methods and reliable methods and tools to use to be able to work through that exercise and engaging with folks meaningfully. We move to then defining the criteria for weighting your questions. So what's going to be the most important? What are those priorities and how are you going to weight them in different ways? We stop and we do a situational analysis or a scoping assessment. And in our case, we did a literature review to really take a stance at what is the literature telling us at this point in time with regards to those priorities we're looking at. We then move to identifying those questions, reaching consensus on those prioritized questions using all of the stakeholders who are interested and involved in that project and your full community. And then, of course, trying to translate those priority questions into research proposals. And this is the key, you know, is moving from creating the priorities to actually getting them translated into questions that can be put into research funding applications. And then once hopefully successful, it's prudent to, of course, go out and conduct the research and implement the results. And then we want to take off and also evaluating that exercise to see if truly the research priority that was put forward is truly bringing the impact that we were hoping it was due, given there's so many stakeholders involved in bringing it to fruition. And here enters an organization called the James Blind Alliance. And this is a UK-based organization that's been around since about 2004. And their main bailiwick is they are all about priority setting partnerships. And so the JLA is an organization that's hosted by the equivalent of their CIHR, their National Institute for Health Research. And their whole, all of their work is really about being able to support priority setting partnerships in terms of they provide consultants who are well versed and know strongly the methodology needed to be able to work through priority setting partnership. They also have lots of tools and work kits and guiding documents that you can use in order to really help your project move forward with it. And then they have this wonderful website where they post a lot of different ways and tips and tools for how to work through these type of projects. And so right from the onset, in our own specific project, we partnered with the James Blind Alliance to ensure that we were really building on their expertise and having that come into our project. And the James Blind Alliance, you know, apart from doing a ton of wonderful things, they've also been looking into research a little bit as to why it is important for us to be, you know, having patients and families involved and clinicians involved in our priority setting exercises. And while this is a busy graph, what I did want to alert your attention to is some of the research that has been happening that's looking at how those priorities play out. And if we look at this column over here on the right, you're going to see that this is sort of the breakdown of the priorities that have been put in that are available in these registered commercial trials. So, and what you see here is that about 85% of those priorities, of those trials, are being conducted on studies related to drugs, vaccines, and biologicals. You juxtapose that to about, you know, a 10% of studies here being done on radiotherapy, devices, and diagnostics kind of interventions. And then this last 2 or 3% up here are studies based on education and training, service delivery, and complementary type of therapies. And now if you think about this kind of where these priorities are, and then take a look all the way over here on the left-hand side of this column, this is the priority setting. These are the type of priorities that are being put forth by patient and clinician stakeholders. And it's vastly different from what we see by those in registered commercial trials, where you're seeing, instead of the 85% being dedicated to drugs and biological research, you hear patients and clinicians really saying they would like under 20% of their research to be dedicated to that kind of priorities. And then equally say, you know, something around another 20% based on those on radiotherapy or surgery or those type of diagnostic type of interventions. And really, the major part of the type of studies that they would like to see when you've got patients and clinicians involved are research, and then this is over 50%. You know, they like to see research dedicated to education and psychological and complementary type of interventions. So it really shows how the differences between how when you involve patients and clinicians in these type of priority setting exercises, how there's a huge shift in where their priorities lie. The JLA, like I said, has been in existence since 2004, and up until today, they just hit a beautiful milestone where they are celebrating the fact that they have accomplished successfully 100 different priority setting partnerships in total across a vast array of different health conditions, some that are listed here in the examples, but also they're international. They're in every single continent, and they've been really, you know, putting a lot of energy into conducting these across the world and bringing some wind to that. And what I was really interested to hear, as I just recently took a look at their website, is that just recently Canada has hired a JLA advisor to be stationed here in Canada, and they've been hired by a government agency in order to help with some priority setting exercises within that government agency. But interesting to see how some of that work that's happened in the UK is now shifting to Canada, as there's some interest in these type of exercises. That's a bit of background as to how we sort of how our specific project came to fruition. And now I'd just like to switch a little bit and talk to you more specifically about our journey and what we call our Canadian Eating Disorder Priority Setting Partnership. It's quite a mouthful. Our acronym is also a mouthful, CEDPSP. But wanting to walk you through that journey and really share with you some of the details there. And so this was a CIHR funded project that we received. We received a small grant from CIHR under the SPOR portfolio to conduct a priority setting partnership. And that we received that back in early 2017. And that project really started before we even got that grant and were successful at getting that grant. That project really started by an investigative team coming together and having some curiosity as to how we can bring our community together to really do some of this priority setting work. And that investigative team was a mighty four that came together. But that mighty four were strategic in that we brought together clinicians, Dr. Mark Norris, who was our clinician on our team. We brought together myself as a researcher. We brought together a decision maker researcher who was the head of our Ontario network for eating disorders, who really helps with a lot of our eating disorder programs across Ontario come together. And then our last team member was a carer with lived experience who heads up an eating disorder advocacy group here in Canada. And it was the four of us that came together that really thought, let's take a stab at trying to establish this here in Canada. And it was really wonderful to come together. So it really started with the four of us coming together and figuring this all out. And of course, this research project and really the spirit of SPOR is all about collaboration and bringing multiple stakeholders together to really establish this type of work. And so I show you a whole bunch of these different organizations that came together, but also wanted to just share with you that our field, the field of eating disorders, small within Canada, but it also had been creating a bit of momentum in terms of bringing folks together from different realms within the field to really try to move the dial a bit on the field of eating disorders. And so you know, this was one exercise that we did where we were sort of bringing folks together, but there was a lot of work being underway that was just sort of, we were capitalizing on some of this work that was coming together to really bring our community together, if you will. And so this project took off with, you know, some research support from the institutions, and we had a pediatric institution and an adult institution to allow for a lifespan approach to this priority setting exercise. We also engaged the 4 national eating disorder organizations that exist in Canada that have all signed on to be collaborators on this project and really supported us with recruitment and helping us get the word out about this project. We had some local partners. We had the Child Health Support Unit also join us, and of course the CIHR that provided lots of their support. And what's also notable in SPOR related research is that when you do get a grant, you are also, it's mandatory that you also receive matched funding from something outside of a research source. And so we're very thankful that we received some matched funding from various different organizations, but the CHEO Research Institute provided some of those matched fundings. We also received some funding from the Looking Glass Foundation, which is an eating disorder foundation based out of BC. We received additional funding from the Eating Disorder Foundation of Canada, and then also had some money that came through our clinical program as well. And talking about sort of the people and how do we get everybody involved, we really thought about, there was a number of partners involved in this and a large community for us to engage. And so we really had to really categorize and think about how do we organize all of this. And this is the way that we really saw it was you'd have, sort of in the middle here, you'd have our investigative team, the 4 folks that I sort of mentioned, plus our JLA consultant who are sort of really spearheading this work and trying to drive it forward. We then engaged a team of 9 folks who became our steering committee, who helped with that oversight. So it wasn't just the research team that was driving this. We then engaged our larger partners, and many of the organizations I showed you on the previous slide. And then our last realm of individuals who were involved in this was our eating disorder community at large, who we went out and got their opinions in order to make this exercise successful. And a priority setting partnership, and specifically our CEDPSP journey, required 5 different steps. And I'll walk through these in a bit more detail to give you a bit more of that pulse. But it really started with getting everybody together to sort of, bring our teams together and all those different stakeholders into the same room to figure out the planning for this. We then moved to our stage 2, which is identifying those uncertainties. Stage 3, where we had to spend a lot of time refining those uncertainties. So how do you do that kind of work? We then moved this into an interim prioritization stage. And then our final stage is where we then launch into a workshop, a face-to-face workshop, where we spend time really dwindling down our priorities to the top 10 that we all decide on. So here's a bit more of that journey and some detail. So as I said, so the first thing that we did when we sort of got on board and were lucky enough to get this funding was we really wanted to join, like I said, partner up with the James Land Alliance, but really it was to find a rigorous and recognized methodology that we could follow in order to establish this. And so not wanting to have, being able to lean on a valid and a tried and true methodology that had already been used and iterated and worked really well was key to allowing this project to come to fruition within the short period of time we had. So we had a year-long grant with a tiny budget and really had to work within that. So having this methodology provided by the JLA and having that consultant help walk us through this was absolutely a key to the success of being able to move this forward. So we're thankful for their support in this. Of course, like I said, was bringing folks together to be able to figure out how do we get our stakeholders involved in different meaningful ways. And as I imagine is like in many other fields of health, when we were thinking about how do we recruit folks, we didn't want to just go to the folks that we often do go to, in our normal day lives to ask them for their help in this, because that felt a bit biased. And so what we wanted to do is, and what we definitely heard from our patient partner, was that we wanted to find a fair and equitable way to get folks involved in this process without it being handpicked, given our field is so small. And so what we decided to do was to do a self-nomination process where we sent out we sent out a survey to a large number of folks right across the Canadian eating disorder community. And we were asking folks to self-nominate to participate in this project in one of 2 ways, in either joining us as a steering committee member or joining us for that workshop that we would do in our final stage of this project, and really to share whether they wanted to be a part of that or not. And we sent that survey out across Canada, left it open for a couple of weeks, and we got 84 responses from across the country of folks who said they put their hand up and said, I'd like to be a part of this project. And from there, we had the process of needing to then try to select those that would be best fit for our steering committee and then for our workshop as well. And again, here we were provided the advice as how do we ensure this again was a fair and equitable process. And so the first thing we did is when we received those 84 responses is that we removed all names or any sort of identifying information. And we really made that selection based on a few different criteria with the whole goal of trying to create the most diverse groups as possible. And when we say diverse, we were looking for diversity across, geographic diversity. Did we have representation from across Canada? Did we have representation from different age categories, different genders, which, not a huge split in the field of eating disorders, but we definitely tried to capitalize on getting as many different gender categories as possible involved. And then we, of course, also wanted to get different diversity in terms of experience within any specific stakeholder category. And so when I say that, when we were selecting specifically clinicians to join us, we didn't want to select 3 physicians, let's say, to be part of this. We wanted to select different types of clinicians who work in the field. And so went after, 1 physician, 1 dietitian, and 1 mental health worker to really round out that experience within that stakeholder group. And so that process led us to selecting anonymously 9 steering committee members to join us, and invited them to join us in this project. And of those 9 members, we had 3 were individuals with lived experience, 3 caregivers, and 3 health professionals. So we had a nice equal split across those. And luckily, everybody who invited agreed to participate. And so we went forward with that steering committee. And then the same process we used for our workshop attendees, where we selected 38 folks, oversampling a little bit here, recognizing that we went onto the land with 30 folks attending our workshop, and so we oversampled again. But again, we kept our partitions in that we had a third of each stakeholder group involved. And so the first step for the steering committee, when we finally had our first meeting back in November of 2017, they had the tough job of trying to scope the project. And so the field of eating disorders is big, with lots of different priorities and lots of different uncertainties that still haven't been uncovered. And so we were really guided by our JLA consultant to scope our project and try to find themes and a focus that would allow us to be able to get good priorities established within them, and would allow us to do that in the sort of limited time and resources that we had. And so it took us 3 90-minute steering committee meetings for us to have ongoing conversation to finally decide. The 2 major focuses of this project is who would we focus the project on, and what are the topics we're going to ask folks to provide. And so what we ended up landing on is the steering committee, the 9 folks along with the investigative team, so 14 of us all together, came together, and we decided that the target population would be based on adult females upwards of late adolescence, so 15 years plus, who have suffered or who suffer or who have suffered from anorexia nervosa specifically. And then the themes for our priorities, we had picked 3, and they were the treatment of anorexia nervosa AN, the concurrent issues that are often associated with AN, and then what kind of support and services available for individuals living with AN. And so based on those, now that we had landed on our focus and our scope, our next step was to then go out to our large eating disorder community and distribute a survey asking folks to provide their thoughts, their opinions, if you will, on what the top research priorities should be. And so we used a red cap survey that, again, got distributed widely throughout our eating disorder community nationally. And this is where we really depended on our partners to help us with this. And so we sent out our own invitations as our small little research team, but then we leaned on our national organization partners and asked them to take an active role in actually getting the word out as well. And so we used lots of their communication channels in order to reach different folks. And the goal there, and really our aim we gave them, is we're trying to hear from those individuals who we normally wouldn't hear from those folks that wouldn't necessarily respond to a survey in sort of those normal channels. And so it was really instrumental in getting a lot of different diverse voices, was having those organizations use their networks and their social communication methodologies in order to reach those folks that we often don't hear from. And that was another key active ingredient to the success of this project. And so we sent out that survey via red caps to everybody, and the ask was fill it out as many times as you want, but please provide us with those priorities and as many as you want at any one go for those 3 different themes, and submit them when you felt prepared. And based on that, we had that survey open for only 3 weeks because of our time limitations. And from that, we landed on getting 897 unique questions or priorities that were posed from 147 different individuals who provided multiple answers. And when we, at the end of those 3 weeks, we started looking through some of those answers and combing through them, and we started realizing we had a bit of satiation and a lot of repetitiveness started happening with those questions that were coming through. And so after those 3 weeks, we decided to close the survey, and we went forward with these almost 900 unique questions that came up from this process. And what's exciting is that, of course, one of the major goals was to hear those priorities, not from one specific stakeholder group, but to really get a good complement of those priorities from all stakeholders involved in our community. And so this was really exciting part of our project, is when we took a look at those who responded to this large survey, we got almost an equal breakdown of folks from the different stakeholder categories providing their responses. And so up here in the orange, you see we have 24% of those who responded were folks with lived experience. We had another 24% of those being caregivers. And so here, just this alone, almost 50% of those who responded to this were folks with lived experience. This other 18% represents those healthcare professionals. And then this other, difference, these little percentages here are folks who, sort of recognize and identify themselves as having two hats in this world. And so really helped us and really formulated and made us feel confident that we had a nice partition and a good diversity of voices that lended their way to this project. And so again, it gave us some more confidence to move forward with the responses that we received. And now here's the slide, but this is the next step of our project, which I'll have to admittedly say was the longest part of our project, the most arduous and probably the hardest piece that we had to work through. So this stage is what we call the refining stage of our project, where we had to take our 897 unique questions and try to figure out how the heck we're going to dwindle those down to the 10 top priorities. Of course, having all voices playing into that process of dwindling it down. And so here's the process that we undertook. The first step we did is we took those 897 responses, and the first thing we needed to do was figure out which questions were considered in scope and which questions were considered out of scope. And out of the almost 900, you'll see that 250 of those questions right off the hop were considered out of scope and were booted out of the process. And so when we say out of scope, we can say things, it could have been priorities that were brought up, let's say about bulimia nervosa, which just happened to be outside of our scope. Or it could have been priorities on pediatric eating disorders, under the age of 15. And so we booted them out of this process just based on the fact that they were out of scope. And then of those 900 almost, there were 606 from this preliminary step that were considered in scope and were those that were sort of carrying forward within this process. One point of engagement where we did bring in more folks to help us is when we met about 43 of these uncertainties or these questions that we, as the investigative team, could not decide whether they were in scope or out of scope. And so instead of leaning on our voices only to make that decision, what we did is we went back to our steering committee and we tasked them with the homework of helping us make those decisions to bring all of those voices into the mix for that. And so we shipped them the 43 uncertainties. We asked them to do the homework on their own to tell us whether they believed this was in scope or not in scope. And then as a research team, we brought that all back together. We gathered that input and we put it all together. And then basically by majority vote, which we decided which ones would be in and which ones would be out based on their responses. And so from that process, 27 more were deemed out of scope and they were just sort of perfed or dropped out of the process. And then 16 of those were considered in scope and they were added to the 606 above. And so we landed sort of optimally from this first stage with 622 questions that were considered in scope. And now, while that was, less than 900, it was still a huge number of questions and kind of qualitative statements that we needed to work through. And so here we started another arduous process where we had to take these 622 and start doing what I call clumping or categorizing them or bringing them down and putting them in different themes that sort of held together, if you will. We did kind of like a factor analysis for those stats people out there. We did a factor analysis of these questions, if you will, trying to find the commonalities and putting them together. And so from that process, you can imagine we had a lot of repetitiveness in some questions and the obvious questions that you would see almost across any healthcare field, I imagine, it's like, what's the best treatment, those kind of questions. We'd get a lot of those. And so we start clumping those together to really try to dwindle these things down. But then we also did things like, trying to create larger categories of questions that would encapsulate a number of different little ones to really, in an effort to dwindle these down. And so, we would have questions like, instead of asking, what is the benefits of yoga for individuals with anorexia nervosa, or the role of acupuncture, let's say, we would tie it into, what is the effectiveness of complementary treatments for anorexia nervosa, and then we would allow all of, several of those questions to sort of sit under that larger question. All that to say, large process, but from that, what we ended up doing is going from 622, and we clumped them down into 71 different priorities, which we now call indicative questions, because they sort of represent a whole bunch of extra uncertainties. And it was that 71 questions that we sort of moved forward with that categorization being done. And so the next process in this project was for us to then take those indicative questions and do what we did in that scoping review, where we wanted to cross-validate them against the literature. And doing that would allow us to basically determine, of those 71 questions that were posed by our stakeholders, it would allow us to understand whether any of them had truly already been answered by research. And so we took off on this cross-validation process. And so for that process, what we did is we needed to find, some good evidence, and so in the form of systematic reviews or meta-analyses, that would provide us any confidence that any one of those 71 questions had already been answered by research. And so from that process, we landed on, we ended up finding 255 systematic reviews that were sort of related to any one of those 71 indicative questions. And from that process, we had 18 of those indicative questions that we found were considered answered from the literature. And to be considered answered, we agreed that you would have to have 3 or more systematic reviews, meta-analyses available for sort of a broad indicative question. And then only, you only had to have 1 or more review available if it was sort of a narrow indicative question. And so that's how we move forward with that. And so we removed 18 of those questions being answered. And then the other thing that we did with this literature review process, guided again by the JLA, was we also took the time, we also took the time to look at those systematic reviews and look at the conclusions of those systematic reviews to see if there was any priorities that were identified within the literature that should also be added to this exercise as we went through. And so this was another way, or this was the only way really, that we sort of brought in the research lens into this priority setting exercise, but really adding merit as it had been, worked through a systematic review, and it was truly some further priorities that hadn't been answered according to the literature. And so from that process, we ended up adding 8 more uncertain priorities to our indicative questions, resulting in, you take away 18, you add 8. We ended up having moving from 71 to 61 of these indicative questions that were then moved to the interim ranking survey for further analysis. And now that interim ranking survey, what we did is we wanted to take the 61 and again, try to dwindle that down to a more manageable number. And so we asked the folks who, at the beginning of this process had self-nominated to be a part of this project and who weren't already selected to be part of our steering committee or our workshop. And we asked those remaining about 45 individuals to then fill out our interim prioritization survey, where they were tasked with the idea of reading through those 61 remaining indicative questions and only having to say, not in a rank order, but just providing us their opinion as to which of those, providing us a top 10 in their mind, which were the most important. So just selecting 10 of those that were the most important and submitting those results to us. We amalgamated those results, and what we ended up finding was, of the 61, 21 of those questions were prioritized as important by at least 20% of our respondents. And so the steering committee agreed to move those forward and bring those 21 priorities to our final stage of this exercise, which is our workshop, our face-to-face workshop, which we held 18 months after starting this process. And so that last stage, or this last stage of this exercise, was really taking those 21 indicative questions that you can see have been dwindled down already quite a bit. And now we have to establish the top 10 of those 21. But keeping in mind, at this point, those 21 questions are already, questions that are already highly valued by our community. So it sounds easy to go from 21 to 10, but now you're talking about the 21 most valuable questions already. And so dwindling down to the top 10 was a bit harder for our folks. And so we arrived at the final workshop. This was a face-to-face workshop. It feels weird to say this in these days nowadays, but this is where we ended up bringing 28 folks from across Canada to Toronto for a one-day workshop where they had an immense task of trying to dwindle down our priorities to the top 10. And this workshop, again, guided by the JLA methodology, was a really neat day, I have to say, because it consisted of a number of different activities for us to land at the top 10. And so it consisted of a series of things where we first asked our workshop attendees before they came to the day for them to first go through the 20, to get themselves familiarized with the 21 questions, and then from there select what they thought were their top 3 and also select their bottom 3. And they were to come to the workshop with those already in mind. And so they showed up. And the first exercise we did was we broke folks up we did introductions and welcome everyone, of course, but then we broke everybody up into into 3 breakout groups. And we had these folks sit together in their smaller group and go through why they selected the top 3 and the bottom 3. And at the same time that we were doing that, we were taking that rank order. There's co-facilitators sitting in each one of those breakout groups, and we were taking those rank orders down at the same time. And once that small breakout group exercise was done, what we did is we brought all of those rankings together across the 3 groups, and we created what was our first initial ranking numbers built out of that consensus driven by those 3 different groups. And then what we did is we took that new ranking and we used these lovely physical cards, that we laid out on tables, and then we broke our group up again into these small breakout groups, and we had folks now go through the exercise of visually looking at whether they agreed with this rank order, trying to rank them in the order, with 1 being the most important, and 21 being the least important in their mind, and having discussion to figure out if that's truly the ranking that they agreed with. And so this generated a ton of really rich conversation, of course, and it allowed folks to shift their ranking around. We allowed that process to happen. Again, we did that piece where we brought the 3 rankings from the 3 different groups together, created a master ranking based on a consensus from those 3, and then did that step again, where we then created new breakout groups, sent them back out into their respective rooms, gave them the new master ranking, and told them to go through it again and make sure they were really confident with the way we were ranking them. They did that. We took that rankings again, brought it back together, and created our last master ranking, and then brought everybody back into the room, all 28 folks into the room, put up what was landed on that last master sort of ranking, and really focused in on the top 10, and had a large group discussion as to whether everybody was in agreement. And I have to tell you, we use lots of different tools and facilitation records, and it felt like you were dancing up there a little bit, trying to guide to create consensus on the top 10, as of course there's no way to get that perfect for everybody, but we used a lot of consensus building activities, and a little bit of the pressure of time, and probably the facilitator's sweat, which guided folks to sort of really allow us to get to that culmination point of voting and taking a majority vote if everybody agreed with the top 10. And I'll show you from this lovely picture and the smiles you're seeing on your face that we were able to indeed get to that point. And it was a really, really warm moment where we all celebrated ourselves for doing incredible work and really achieving this process by the end of it. And really wonderful, wonderful opportunity to engage with different stakeholders. So with our final top 10 research priorities, here they are. We created a lovely infographic to share these, and not wanting to go into too many details about the priorities themselves, I'm just going to walk you through a few of them, or I'll walk you through all of them, but in some brief detail. So looking at these priorities, the first one, and that ranks number 1, is of course, what is the short and long-term efficacy of treatment methods for anorexia nervosa at different ages, and which ones are the best? And this one, it's 1 question, but it was made up of 35 original questions. Priority 2 is what are the most helpful and least helpful treatment elements as identified by recovered individuals, and what long-term outcomes do they perceive them to help with? And this was made up of 8 original questions. Priority number 3 was related to collecting data. So what are, of those diagnosed with AN, what are the rates of recovery, relapse, dropouts, and length of treatment across Canada? And this one was really exciting for me as a researcher because I'm always interested, of course, and have a lot of turn my eye towards needing big data to be able to really, move the dial in the field. But to hear all of these different voices also agree that that is a top priority for us was a really interesting finding for myself personally, and I heard this from other folks as well. Priority 4 is interesting to me because it says, once recovered or discharged from services, what is the most effective way of preventing relapse for anorexia nervosa? Made up of 20 questions. Priority 5, what are the best ways to educate healthcare professionals and educators about AN, and how does this impact early identification rates? Priority 6, how could the system better support individuals with AN and help them transition through their transition periods, going from pediatric care to adult care and the such. Priority 7, made up of 25 questions, is what are the most effective way of treating co-occurring or comorbid disorders associated with AN? Number 8, what are the effects of repeated inpatient admissions for AN, and what should there be different treatment options available for these folks? Priority 9, what is the most effective way of educating families and caregivers on anorexia nervosa and ways to support patients through recovery? And the last one, and number 10, was again related to data and what are the wait times across Canada for adolescent girls and women suffering from anorexia nervosa? Are they equitable, and how can we decrease these wait times for service? And so those are the top 10 research priorities. Our last stage of this project was, not only to arrive at these priorities, but then to get these out and get these into the hands of researchers and funders, if you will, to really try to get these priorities realized, if you will. And so from a knowledge engagement point of view, we were lucky enough that at the end of this project, it just happens to be that it coincided with when we had our annual Eating Disorder Association of Canada conference. And so we were invited to present as a part of a plenary the findings of our priority setting exercise. And while that was incredibly exciting and such a lovely venue for us to share this exercise, what it also, when we brought this to the steering committee members and shared with them that we had this opportunity, the first thing they said to us was, we have spent this whole time, this whole project trying to be fair and equitous and making sure that everybody is, all stakeholders are involved in every part of this process. But it seems like a shame for us to now be sharing this and doing this knowledge translation with only sort of one stakeholder group and not with our full community. And so we took this to heart and we really started brainstorming, how can we sort of do this knowledge translation piece also with that sort of full continuum of folks involved. And so what we did decide as a group was to send out, and we scheduled, we put together like this lovely infographic describing our process and that, allowed us to have this top 10 sort of posted within it. And we had that as an email mail out ready to be scheduled to be sent out to our whole eating disorder community across the country. And we scheduled that to be released at the same time as the plenary started. And so we had this nice sort of process where everybody was sort of being released these results at the same time, and it was going to the full community and not specifically one stakeholder group. We also wrote this up for publication and invited and got published in the International Journal of Eating Disorders, but our full team, our full investigative team were co-authors on this project, including our patient partner who was with us from the beginning of the project. And some reflection, just as we're coming to the tail end of this presentation, some reflections that I took from this project were a few things. The first is, apologies, the dog is also interested. So a few reflections is that, this was an incredibly powerful moment and a powerful exercise where we had a lot of voices coming together, and that was reflected, and we heard that almost unanimously through all of the evaluations we did and from all of the different members who participated. And so really, really a wonderful way to bring our community together in a meaningful way. We also heard that all of our stakeholders really wanted to remain invested and engaged in doing some of this work. And so that how could we continue to work doing patient-oriented research and engaging our full community in all of these type of exercises, and that was another big reflection from this. And the last reflection that I'll put out there was, when you look at those priorities and you see the one they come, those 10 priorities, I can't help but feel that those priorities are definitely shifted because of the different voices that we had involved. And so I'm not sure, and I'm likely willing to bet that if you had only researchers involved in creating those priorities, that you likely wouldn't have had priorities related to how do we educate families in this? And how do we, one of those priorities that was, how do we lean on those who are recovered to better understand how to create better treatments? I'm not sure those priorities would have landed in this top 10 if it was just researchers making those calls, but definitely you can see those shifts when you have different voices involved. And so the obvious next step is, how can we utilize these priorities and some next steps? And really the major goal is to get these priorities into the hands of researchers and other organizations that are interested to then turn them into funding applications and then getting that research realized. And so, lots of different ways for us to be doing that. But I just wanted to point out specifically, our team has taken a specific interest in doing some of that work and really trying to advance some of those priorities. And so in the more recent years, what we've been doing is really building on that priority setting exercise. We took one of the priorities number 5, which really spoke to us and had an interest for us on our team here at CHEO, related to early intervention and early identification of those with eating disorders. And we just, thought, let's try to continue this priority forward. And so we put in for a grant just after this exercise finished, really capitalizing. And in our funding grant, we talked about how this was a priority established by this priority setting exercise. And we put in a grant that we were successful with to look at options for early intervention for eating disorders in Canada. And again, we used a full complement of individuals. Team consists of individuals with lived experience, clinicians, policymakers. We've added that to the mix, as well as researchers to try to do some patient-oriented research and really have a rounded out complement of stakeholders involved in this research to kind of redo some of the work that we did in the priority setting exercise. And of course, we're trying to build advisories and our activities where we're fully engaging our community, as we've learned from that previous exercise how important it is to have all of those voices sitting at the table and how that can really shape your project differently based on having everybody equally sitting at the table co-building alongside each other. And so I think I'll stop there and thank you all for your attention, and really, really happy to have been able to share this all with you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicole. That was a really amazing presentation. You really demonstrated for us not only why it's so important to ask patients and families and people with lived experience about their input on priorities for research, but that it's not just a simple matter to just ask them. It's a whole comprehensive process. So you've really outlined that so well for us. We have about just over 5 minutes for questions. There are a lot of participants. There was really good sustained interest in the presentation. So I'm just going to open it up. Looks like Martin is first up with his hand. So Martin, over to you.
Good. Hi. Thanks, Nicole. That was a really wonderful presentation, and congratulations to you and your group. I think that we are just about to embark on a priority setting partnership in concussion in Canada. So we have a lot to learn from you and what you've already done. I was most interested in how you went from the 622 in-scope questions and then down to the 71 questions. And it's something that we're really thinking about in, how do we worry about sort of lack of detail, such that you mentioned, the idea of using yoga for therapy versus acupuncture. And these are questions that people may really want to get answered. But then if you bring them together into, well, we'll just put them all into complementary therapies, is it losing emphasis that people may want on a question? So I was interested in that part of the process, how you decided when to really make things more general and when to keep them more specific, because there may be a real feel in the community that, boy, yoga is really the thing that we want the answer to. I'm interested in your approach to that part, which I think is really tough in this exercise.
Yeah, so you nailed it, Martin. That was absolutely the hardest part of this process and took us the longest period of time. Took us 4 months to get through that process. So I will say it is a big exercise. We used a few tools and tips that the JLA provided to us. So one of them was, kind of collapsing categories that you felt, made sense to come together, But when you, kind of clarified what that larger question could be, they told us, open it up and put a whole bunch of examples at the end of that, and so you could put like, i.e. yoga, acupuncture, whatever it might be, to sort of highlight that. And while you didn't see that in my infographic, that's provided on a website, on our CHEO RI website, where there's more detail provided for each one of those questions. And so I didn't mention this in the talk, but another piece of this is that, we have the top 10 that's kind of out there in a publication format, but we have the top 21 listed on our website and more details provided on our website, which when we published was an absolutely mandatory piece for us to have folks to be able to kind of go back to that and be able to get that detail. And so I would encourage you to do the same, where you put that detail somewhere, but not necessarily maybe in your main documents that get circulated. And then the other piece that I might suggest to you is when we used our steering committee actually to dwindle this down. And so we actually brought a range of stakeholders together for 3 hours. Oh my gosh, and we threw so much coffee and food at them, and we had them sit with us and literally go line by line and try to make those decisions as to what should be put together and what shouldn't. We spent a lot of time. That was a long process, and lots of patient partners sitting around the table helping with us and hearing their voice. And so we took that confidence that we did it together, and it wasn't a decision based on a researcher, that we did it together, and that we put them into statements that made sense, and that really collapsed them into categories that looked like they hung together, if you will.
Well, congratulations. Really, really important work. Well,
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions from the group? Nicole, I have one question that you may not like. Oh, actually, there's one from Pat. I'll hand it over to Pat Longmuir. Go ahead, Pat.
Thanks, Mona. Great presentation, Nicole. Really, really interesting. I'm involved in another network in pediatric exercise medicine that's hoping to embark on a similar process. We just submitted a grant. And the question of using the James Lind Alliance came up. And I was just wondering what your perspective was in terms of that partnership, and what did it cost? Were they manpower to do some of the data collection that you might also have through a researcher, or exactly what did you find their role to be?
So I found the JLA experience to be wonderful. Their organization is very flexible, and they're really trying to meet you where you're at. And so they have different sort of layers of adherence and ways of working with them. And you kind of decide together what makes the most sense for your specific project. And so in terms of cost, you can have a JLA consultant literally run your whole project. Of course, you're going to pay for that. You can have them run the whole project for you as the lead and really the facilitator of the whole project. You can have them where they're working more in a collaborative or a support role, where they're just sort of lending their consultation to you in different ways. They don't necessarily do the data collection for you. They can offer to send the invitation or make it, put stuff on their website to get the word out, but they're not necessarily going to do it for you. That's really left to the research team. But in terms of working with them, I found them very flexible. I found them very knowledgeable, and I found them really able to meet us where we're at and bend to our local context, if you will, given that, every country has different sets of rules and things conditions that they abide by. So was really impressed with their methodology.
Great.
Just to say, I know other priority setting partnerships take on different methodologies using Delphi studies or different methodologies. In my experience and through a lot of the reading that I've done, the JLA methodology is probably the most rigorous of what I've understood in terms of the priority setting partnerships and these exercises. And so if you have the opportunity to work with them and use that methodology, I kind of think that's a great if you have that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay, well, we're at time. Nicole, I was going to ask you, now that you've done all this work, what the part of the process is to ensure that your priorities remain current. Because it's easy after all this time for some things to have shifted. Can you just speak briefly about that?
That's a fantastic question, actually, Mona. So I have two thoughts, so one of these things is if you saw those questions, they are kind of a bit timeless, when you think about, we can always be enhancing our treatments and always coming up with a better treatment, as things progress in our world. And so they're general enough, I think, that they can provide us some, they're a bit timeless, there's no time period to them. But at the same time, what will move out of date, if you will, is our cross-validation pieces. So which priorities did get answered, when I think about priority number 3, which is about big data, if we do have the opportunity to sort of create a registry in eating disorders or have the ability to really capture big data, that priority will become kind of, irrelevant. And so what we might need to do from a time piece of it is just review which priorities are truly getting answered and can be knocked off the list. But I think without redoing this full exercise with its entirety, I think we kind of have to go with this slice in time and kind of use them and capitalize them in this kind of period.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree. They are mostly all very timeless and very topical. And I really congratulate you and your team on all this work. And thank you again for the great presentation.
I appreciate it.
Very informative, and you've shown us the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll sign off now.